Ready? Okay. All right, everyone. I want to get us started as close to promptly at 2:15 as possible. Make sure we're on schedule for the rest of the afternoon. As you see, the title of this session is Local Law Enforcement Perspective, View from the Front. I purposely called it that because, we often hear about a potential attack on the Homeland or a terror attack on America. And I would argue that that really is a misnomer. Really, there is no such thing as an attack on the Homeland. There's no such thing as an attack on America. As a practical matter, any terror attack would take place in a city. And I would argue that there are three cities in which a terror attack is most likely to happen: New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. And our featured guest for this session has been the chief of two of those three cities, the only man in history to have that distinction. And to guide the questioning for that session will be CNN's Jeanne Meserve, the Homeland Security correspondent there, from whom you heard earlier today. Jeanne.
Thank you so much, Clark. Chief Bratton, thank you so much for joining us. Your name has been invoked several times already today, and in this last conversation, a lot of discussion about the information sharing issue and a wonderful question about your fusion center. 4 states, how many data points, and you couldn't get that information upstream?
By way of explanation, there are now, I think, in excess of 60 fusion centers, almost all of them created post 9/11. The comments were made that Fran Townsend spoke to it, that they are not generic in the sense they are not all alike, and that is an issue. What they all attempt to do is gather information, analyze it, make intelligence out of it, and then move it up the food chain to the counterterrorism task forces, move it into the Counterterrorism Center in Washington, D.C. In Los Angeles, myself and Sheriff Barker had an initiative working with close cooperation with several other states, very specifically with Las Vegas, for example, Sheriff Doug Gillespie in Las Vegas. The idea being that we would, within our fusion center and several others, we make an effort to, in a regional way, share information. For example, fusion centers are intended to capture not just terrorism-related information, but the term is used, all crime fusion centers. So traditional crime information that we would get when we do stop and frisk reports, when we do arrest sheets, when we do intelligence reports, all that information would be sent into the fusion center to be looked at alongside information that might be coming in that is very specifically terrorist-related. The belief being that as the threat of homeland security became much more of an internal threat rather than an external threat, that the access to crime data would in fact possibly give us early warnings of an evolving plot. The issue in Los Angeles, we were able to engage a significant number of counties, states, to share crime information and terrorism information. The idea being it would improve our capabilities to detect. The issue that was raised, the indemnification issue, it's one of those frustrating issues that comes up in this area. You have civil liberties concerns about gathering information. You have bureaucratic concerns among city attorneys, federal attorneys, about if a piece of information is used inappropriately, who's going to bear the burden of paying the ultimate penalty if the government is to be sued. It's unfortunate. I think it's unnecessary with the threat of terror, with the threat of traditional crime. I think we can really pass on the issue of indemnification.
Can you give us any specific examples of valuable information that was compiled in your fusion center that didn't get pushed up the chain?
No. I could not, seriously.
Was it still valuable for you, however, on a regional level? I mean, you still were seeing patterns and...
I'll be very frank with you. As chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, I did not spend a lot of my time on what was going on in the fusion center. Right. When it reached a significant point of prioritization or concern, it would be brought to my attention. But the hundreds of thousands of pieces of information going through that place every day or every week or every month, those are not things that would have been brought up to my level of attention.
You mentioned that they aren't standardized, that you had a model fusion center, but some of them are less functional. Should there be a national standard for these? And who should set it?
I actually believe there should be a generic structure to them. One, for example, that all of them be all crime centers. The idea that they have the capability to take the criminal information from all of the police agencies in their area of responsibility to be able to match it up against the much smaller terrorism-related specific information. Secondly, there is some debate about should the centers also be emergency operations centers. The state of New Jersey, for example, their state police run their center, but it's an emergency operations center used during times of natural disaster as well as terrorism-related. There is no generic pattern for that across the country. Congress looked at it several years ago, came out with a list of recommendations, but at this particular point in time, there really is not a consensus about that standardization. Some of that has to do with the way they're funded. Some of them are funded by federal resources, some funded by state resources, some by agency resources. There's actually not a standardized way in which they're funded either.
And is that problematic at this point in time with budgets being as stretched as they are?
Budgets are the source of all problems, and exactly right, that the number of personnel, for example, that the Los Angeles Police Department or the Sheriff's Department might be in a position to assign to the Fusion Center is impacted by the budget difficulties they're facing. Homeland Security, whatever their budget is in terms of their representation. FBI. To get our Fusion Center up and running, it was called the Joint Area, JRIC, Joint Area Regional Information Center. It was largely funded by the FBI initially, $3 to $4 million. Myself and Sheriff Barker provided a lot of personnel to the entity and some funding. But again, there is no standardization of who pays for it. And in these times of tight budgets, the concern I would have, the concern that all of us should have, is that this is an area that can be significantly weakened as police chiefs, sheriffs in particular, are facing draconian cuts in the number of personnel that they have, a lot of political pressure from city councilmen, county board of supervisors. They want cops in black and whites. Nobody sees these people working in a fusion center, working with computers. They're out of sight, out of mind. They're not visible to the public at all. And the work that they do oftentimes goes unheralded because you just don't see the results of it.
The federal government reorganized itself to a certain degree to try and deal with information more coherently, created the Director of National Intelligence. From where you sat, did that make a bit of difference?
It still seems that there is a great deal of tension and frustration and maybe even confusion as to who has responsibility for what. If I understand it correctly, DNI was created going back to Mr. Negroponte, I think was the first one that was put into that position, to try to take the 18, 20, 22, whatever number of federal agencies have intelligence gathering responsibilities, to try to put them under an umbrella and to put them into some type of coordinated system. And I think the idea behind the DNI leadership creation was that this would be a person that would be able to, through budgetary, political power of the president, be able to coordinate those activities to ensure that information was being shared, that parochialism and the various boundaries that are oftentimes created, sometimes artificially, unfortunately, between agencies could be broken down. But as we've seen, we've had, 4 heads of DNI in 6, 7 years. It is a suicide mission from my perspective. Why anybody would want the position, I don't know, other than out of sheer act of patriotism and the belief that they can get something done. The most recent brouhaha, if I understand it correctly, and Secretary Chertoff maybe had to offer more of a clarification, that in the most recent flare-up, the head of DNI effectively lost a battle of access and influence with the President of the United States to the head of CIA, when in fact, if I understand it correctly, the head of CIA in many respects was supposed to report up through the head of DNI. So it looks like the subordinate basically got rid of the boss. And so that doesn't bode well for the idea of the sharing of intimate information in a collegial, in a professional fashion.
And as a big city chief, how did that impact you? When you saw this division, the turf battles being fought, and the failure to share, perhaps for turf reasons, perhaps for other reasons, between, let's say, a DHS and an FBI. What were the ramifications for you?
That's a very good question, because in fact that was the reality of what I and my colleagues in major city positions in particular. There are 63 major cities in the United States that belong to the Major City Chiefs organization. For a period of time I was privileged to be president of that organization. And one of the frustrations that we had after 9/11 was trying to convince the now reforming federal government of the importance of local policing, particularly at the large urban level, the importance of letting us into the tent for the sharing of information, for the use of information that we could gather, that all crimes type of information, for the manpower that we could bring to the issue, 700,000 to 800,000 local law enforcement personnel, usually better working relationships with the 2.5 million private security officers that work for private security in our cities and our towns, that we literally had to argue for several years to get a place at the table. And then we had to argue to move farther up the table to get closer to where decisions were being made. Secretary Chertoff, during his time, particularly toward the last year or so of his tenure, really recognized that value and that capacity increase that could be gained by using the resources of local police. But the problem for our local police, when there is confusion at the federal government as to who's in charge, is who do you interact with? Do you deal with the head of the FBI? Do you deal with the head of Homeland Security? Are you even empowered to talk with the head of DNI? I was fortunate in terms of coming out of Los Angeles, like my colleague Ray Kelly at the time, myself no longer being in policing, Ray is still in New York. Because of the uniquenesses of those two cities, Los Angeles and New York, along with Washington, and the likelihood that those three cities would be top priorities for terrorist attacks, that we had probably more access than others would have to whether it was the head of the FBI or the head of DNI or the head of Homeland Security. But as the turf battles went on, that who do you align yourself with? Who do you actually feel has the clout to get things done, the clout to give you access, the clout to make things happen at the local level?
Do you feel there's been improvement?
Well, I think there has, but again, the recent flare-up once again reinforces that we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. That in the sense that we are on a journey, the destination is not quite clear. It certainly during my 7 years back in policing from 2002 to 2009, there were very significant improvements in the situation. As to the last couple of months, we'll have to wait till the dust settles and see, is everybody going to make nice with each other now in the federal government level?
You mentioned that local police had gotten a better place at the table. Do they have the place at the table they should have yet, or is there still further to go?
Well, I think there's really a beginning under Secretary Chertoff during his last couple of years, and certainly the prioritization of Secretary Napolitano in speech after speech, policy development after policy development. She has really pushed the concept that Homeland Security is really hometown security. It was a seemingly trite phrase back in 2000, 2003 when it was first coined, but that has become the increasing reality as the fear of terrorism, other than the catastrophic fear, biological, nuclear, has shifted from the international external threat, as Al-Qaeda has really been kept underground and has lost its ability to put together an attack of that type of significance. The homegrown threat has become much more important, as evidenced by just what's gone on here over the last several years, and the acceleration as the homegrown threat has become more significant. That is where there's a growing appreciation that at the local level, it is quite likely that a potential threat might be detected by local police or local security or local personnel before the FBI or the CIA or any of the other federal agencies would get wind of it.
I want to explore that at more length, but first, while we're on the information sharing, you get bulletins periodically from the Department of Homeland Security and FBI. Are those at all useful, or are they so generic that You can just put them in the circular file.
The ones that would come over the BlackBerry that I don't get them any longer. That's so my BlackBerry traffic's a lot less than I used to. Oftentimes we're generic; they're informational in nature. And the problem that existed when I was in the business, and my assumption would be still continues to this day, is the time it takes to get vetted, the time it takes to get cleared, if you will. Oftentimes, that's critical time that at the local level, we were advocating that, look, we need information much more quickly. Let us make a decision. Does it pertain to us in our situation? And that was the rub, in the sense that the federal government not needlessly wanting to be crying wolf time after time after time, and to the extent that then at the local level, eventually we would say to ourselves, well, the information's of no use to us because there's no foundation to it. It's still a tension that exists, but it's an understandable tension. You don't want to be sounding the fire alarm so often that when the real fire occurs, that nobody responds.
On the homegrown threat, how do local departments have to adapt and change what they do to focus more on the potential that something's going to happen in their town or city?
It takes a lot of effort, and let me give you several examples that the Secretary Chertoff mentioned a little while ago, the idea of the suspicious activity reporting system that was developed in Los Angeles by the Los Angeles Police and our colleagues in that area, that was funded and ultimately adopted by Homeland Security as a national model, and then now funding training around the country. The idea being that if you believe that the growing threat of terrorism is a hometown threat, then we need to do a better job of educating the 700,000 or 800,000 police officers in the United States what to watch for, what are the characteristics, what are the patterns, trends, behaviors. And that's what SARS is all about, the idea of educating police generically around the country and encouraging within their policies and procedures ways for officers to easily report a piece of information that they suspect might in fact be the precursor to a potential terrorist act. So in the case of the Los Angeles Police Department, structurally, and one of the benefits of being a large department is you can focus resources on these types of things, which is oftentimes not readily available to smaller departments, but by doing it in a city like LA, you can basically test it, proof it, and then spread it out at a much less cost to smaller agencies. We created on our basic police reporting form a checkoff box that if an officer, after receiving training, thought that as he was conducting his or her daily routines had come across a piece of information that might have a terrorism connection, check the box, just a quick couple of words. At each of our 21 police stations, we had specially trained officers, terrorism liaison officers, who would catch that checkbox, do the initial review, and then very quickly move that information into our counterterrorism entity, department entity, which would then review it and then move it very quickly into our Fusion Center. Fusion Center would then review it collaboratively with all of the various agencies in the Fusion Center. And if it was felt that this was an actionable piece of information, could then be moved up both to Joint Terrorism Task Force, but also moved along to Washington. So
and what about to other fusion centers?
The other fusion centers, the idea was to take this model nationally. Homeland Security is very aggressive in trying to fund national pilot programs that then have applicability to the nation as a whole. So beginning with Secretary Chertoff and continuing and expanding under Secretary Napolitano, there's any number of initiatives that have been supported. Just recently, within the last week or so, one that Sheriff Barker and the major city chiefs and my predecessor, Gil Kulikowski, who was chief of Seattle at the time, is now the drug czar. We were advocating the training of forces, 40, 50, 60 officer teams, very similar to these teams that go into disaster areas with the rescue dogs, et cetera, that in a situation like in New Orleans, that New Orleans, after Katrina, desperately needed police services. And we would bring a lot of officers in from all over the country, but they had never trained together, they never worked together. And oftentimes that organizational type of confusion just breeds more confusion. The idea here is to have around the country cadres of officers who could quickly be brought together in a team that is trained together, and then you could ship 400, 800, 1,200 officers who are used to working in platoon-sized contingents into these various states to deal either with an emergency or a terrorism-related act. Secretary Napolitano, just within the last couple of weeks, basically okayed the pilot program for that initiative, something that the major city chiefs were very excited about. So there's been much more willingness to listen to locals, the ideas that we have. And that's very important because the similarity between fighting crime successfully and now fighting the new type of crime, terrorism, most of the ideas that came about in the 1990s when we finally got a handle on fighting traditional crime in the United States came from local police. They didn't come from the federal government, they didn't come from the federal agencies. They were partners, they funded it, they helped to promulgate it nationally, but most of the ideas came from local police agencies who were dealing with these local issues. Similarly, if we are going to have an emphasis on hometown security concerns, we have to let the people who are in the hometowns have a way of percolating their ideas up into the larger arena of the nation. And that's a function of Homeland Security, to look at these things, pilot them, test them out, and then if they think they're going to work, push them right back out again.
One thing you did in your department was, when you were in Los Angeles, was form an intelligence unit or beef up your intelligence unit considerably. Talk to us a little bit about that, and tell me if you then were playing in the FBI's sandbox.
Okay. One of the differences from the time I was police commissioner in New York City, 1994 to 96, and returning to policing in 2002 as chief of Los Angeles, post 9/11, I was commissioner in New York within 1 year of the first World Trade Center bombing that my predecessor and now successor, Ray Kelly, handled. I don't think during my 2 years as commissioner in New York, where we were focusing very heavily on traditional crime, that I spent 1% of my time on terrorism. That the idea was they tried to blow up the World Trade Center, we got them, it's over. Our counterterrorism task force is working with the feds. We'll deal with what was thought to be an external threat. Coming back in 2002, within a year of 9/11, I easily spent 40 to 50% of my time as police chief in Los Angeles on terrorism-related activities, either attending meetings, growing the resources of my department. The LAPD, 9,000 officers, had 30 officers focused on terrorism pre-9/11, and within a year of my arriving, we grew it to 300 officers. The number of officers in LA is roughly equivalent to the number of officers that Ray Kelly has in New York City. Why? As chief of police, I believed and still believe that LA, like New York and Washington, would still remain one of the most likely targets because of a significant attack and the impact it could have on the economy. So it was worth that investment. To maximize that investment, it was not just a matter of improving the internal capabilities, but also to improve the external coordination capabilities. So to that end, we were very aggressive in seeking out partners. Sheriff Barker, for years the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department had kind of bumped up against each other. FBI, basically they would spend most of their time investigating us rather than working with us. And that was the reality of the 1990s in Los Angeles. And we attempted to overcome those parochial and historic differences. And I believe we did, because there was a willingness on the part of Barker, a succession of FBI directors, Bob Mueller, who I'd had the opportunity to work with prior to LA, so I had a relationship with. And so the idea of, because it was thought that I had a special relationship with him, the heads of the office in LA were maybe usually a little more responsive to me than they might have been. But we did really forge, I believe, and it's usually echoed by those in Washington, Secretary Chertoff, Mueller, or the Attorney General recently, Eric Holder, that there's something special going on in Los Angeles where that we do seem to have developed a seamless relationship for the purposes of working with each other, sharing information. Not to say that we sometimes don't bump into each other's lanes, but we don't cause a catastrophic collision.
Do you send, or did you send, members of your intelligence unit overseas when there was a terrorist act overseas? Did your people go and take a look at what was happening?
I would have liked to have done that. Ray
Because
Kelly
New
in
York does that.
Ray Kelly in New York, with private funding, interestingly enough, that whole effort is privately funded by the Police Foundation, has either 8 or 10 police officers from New York based overseas. I think he just recently expanded it. New York's situation is a special one in that there was a real belief there that at a time when the partnership was not a good one with the federal agencies, and the NYPD didn't believe that the information was being collected and being shared appropriately, that it was incumbent on them to develop their own sources, if you will. And that also the tension about what information should be shared. As a police chief, I want the information, then I and my mayor will make a decision, do we respond to it? Is this of importance to us, even though at the national level they don't think that the information is actionable? Well, national level has one perspective, at the local level we might have another. And so Kelly on his own has developed a very formidable counterterrorism entity that does include this capability to have people overseas, to develop face-to-face relationships, because the sharing of intelligence oftentimes is based on relationships. I know you, you know me, we trust each other, rather than just some bureaucrat calling up after a crisis to say, what can you tell me? I don't know you, so I'm not going to tell you anything. I would have liked that capability, didn't have the resources to do it, but did have the resources to send people overseas in response to a major event. In the case of Mumbai, when the Mumbai attacks occurred, we sought permission to send people overseas to take a look at that circumstance, but we were not able to get the appropriate visas and authorization to travel. Kelly, I think, already had people in the area, so he was able to get in there almost instantaneously and got a lot of firsthand information very quickly. It took us a while longer in LA to get some of the specifics about what had happened in that event. In that particular event, which you'll all have the opportunity, I believe, tonight. Is tonight the Mumbai experience? I was fortunate that, as chief in LA, that within a relatively short period of time, but it was still several weeks to a month after the Mumbai initiative, that we began to get actionable intelligence about what had happened in Mumbai that caused me as police chief in Los Angeles to totally reorganize my whole department to respond to what we perceive to be a new form of terrorism threat.
Was there any other terrorist event that changed your training, your deployment, the way Mumbai did? Or is that unique?
As much as that, no. There were things that we would learn that would refine some of the training, some of the equipment. But Mumbai was
more fundamental?
It was a very significant event in that, and as you'll see tonight as they go through it, the nature of the attack, the idea that you could have 10 of these characters, poorly educated, who became radicalized very quickly, who would be just willing to go into this city with minimalist training, minimalist equipment, and hold that city hostage for 3 days, take a lot of lives, and draw the attention of the world. A very simple event to pull off in many respects. And how they were able to use basic cell phone technology to monitor both how it was being reported in the news, but to stay in touch with their handlers. And also the issue that was of great concern to us was the idea, the information that the FBI, based on their investigation of this incident, was able to provide, is that normally in a situation where hostages are taken, traditional policing has always been, by and large, to try and rescue the hostages. So you contain, you begin to negotiate, you try to buy time. What Mumbai clearly showed was, in dealing with terrorists, they were not going to let those people live. They're going to kill them. What they were looking for was exactly what happened, that they were on CNN for 48 hours, 72 hours. And so they were able to spread their fear and their panic throughout the world for an extended period of time. But they were going to die, and they were going to kill those people. So
how did that change what you did in Los Angeles?
As in Los Angeles, we had a 60-person SWAT team, which was the principal force we would rely on to respond to a Columbine situation, hostage situation, barricaded person situation. And they were our most highly trained, most well-equipped. Additionally, we have several hundred officers in the department who, at any given time, I might have several dozen officers in the department who would have high-powered weaponry that they were trained to use in their vehicles. And that's as a result of a bank holdup in Northridge in the 1990s that many of you may saw the two characters who were armed to the teeth and had bulletproof vests on, who literally held the city of Los Angeles hostage for 2 hours, that we had thought we had sufficient firepower and sufficient personnel to deal with what we thought the threat might be up until Mumbai. Mumbai clearly showed that terrorists could very easily come in and do 7, 8, 10 things at the same time, not just in the city of Los Angeles, but regionally, the county. And that we would not have been prepared at that time to deal with that effectively. We could deal with 2 or 3, but to deal with that threat, we were not prepared. So we literally, within 60 days, totally reorganized the Los Angeles Police Department, did tabletop exercises, worked with the Bureau, worked with the Sheriff's Department, began to acquire many more significant assault weapons. And the thrust of how we would approach that situation was not to basically contain, but to get in as quickly as possible, kill them before they would kill the hostages. That the idea is that these people, the negotiations are only for purposes of buying time, that you were never going to be able to negotiate the surrender of the hostages.
Have other departments made that adjustment?
That I don't know. That each, it's a country like ours, that each police chief, each organization, in terms of their training, make their own decisions relative to that. I thought it important as chief of Los Angeles, and the prioritization that I always placed on terrorism, it was one of our top 3 priorities, that the department needed to have the capability to deal with the traditional hostage barricaded person situation, but also if we were to have a Mumbai type of event. And when you see tonight how easy it was to pull that event off, that we needed to have this additional capacity to deal with the shifting of the terrorist threat. And that's the importance of intelligence sharing, the timely sharing of information, because the threat is constantly evolving. We're very concerned with Al-Qaeda actually masterminding and pulling off the attacks now because of the drone attacks, et cetera, that they pretty much don't have that capacity as best I understand it, but they do have the capacity to influence and inspire. And the most recent incidents we've experienced in the United States have literally been those that have been inspired.
You mentioned in Mumbai their use of everyday technology to execute their attack. Did you make any shifts in how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to do more cell phone jamming, let's say, if you have an incident?
Some of that, as you might appreciate, I won't speak to the specificity of that, that there's a wide range of technology solutions to some of what was learned in the Mumbai initiative. Mumbai was probably one of the most significant learning experiences, much the same as we learned a lot out of Columbine years ago with the school assaults. Mumbai, for me, during my time, 7 years in LA, was one of the most significant. And I felt very good because of the prioritization we had placed on it going back to 2002. We had the capacity. I had with the 300 officers and the highly trained people who had been in place for, to literally, on a dime, turn the department, totally retrain the whole department, refocus it, acquire the equipment to face the new threat. And that's what you want. You want that capacity to, as the threat changes, and the threat is constantly evolving, it's accelerating, which is also scary. If you look at the timing of the attacks that we have been able to fend off in the United States, it's not that they're coming from a different place, they're coming from within, but they're coming with much more frequency.
They are 25 people since the first of the year on terrorism charges in the U.S.
And now the Russians are coming again.
Right,
Who knew?
exactly, exactly. I asked you earlier, and I'm not sure you addressed this, about the issue of your playing in the FBI sandbox when a local police department is doing intelligence work. Did that create more friction, and did it make it more difficult, in some respects, to get information when you needed it from the FBI?
The friction in Los Angeles was, I'm going to be very specific about a couple of the issues, that the FBI would have preferred that the extra resources that I was able to prioritize and apply to terrorism, that they should have all gone into the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The idea of the total sharing of information within this inclusive entity. The problem I had with that, however, was of necessity, and it's been talked about through all the previous presenters, the sheer amount of information, you have to prioritize. As good as the computer systems are at analyzing information, connecting the dots, a human being still at some point in the time makes the final decision. Do we investigate this? Or that human being's perspective is, no, this is something we can put off to the side, or resource limitation, something I have to put off to the side. In Los Angeles, we had the capacity, with the number of personnel that we had assigned to this function, we beefed up the staffing in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, but to deal with those investigations which the Joint Terrorism Task Force did not feel met their threshold, but our people at the ground level felt they wanted to pursue further. I had the luxury of having resources that I could prioritize to continue those investigations on our own, with the understanding that that information would keep flowing back into the Fusion Center. But the Bureau would have preferred that the guardrails, that we stayed more within their guardrails. So we had some tension over that, but it wasn't the butting of the heads. We had conversations about it. And it's the same situation that Ray Kelly finds himself in New York. Kelly, because he devotes so many resources to this, has a lot of people he can use to do things that the feds don't have the resources to do.
And sometimes it doesn't work right. I mentioned this morning the Zazi case.
Well, the one that was discussed this morning, the idea of sometimes inadvertently stepping on somebody else's investigation, but
How often does it happen?
I don't think it happens with tremendous frequency, being quite frank with you, in the terrorism world, because fortunately there are still relatively few of these investigations versus the more traditional world. Back when we were battling the good old mafia in the good old mafia days, there might have been more of that battling. I can remember, I'm a product of Boston in the 1980s, and if any of you saw the movie The Departed with that movie was so accurate as to what was going on in Boston in the 1980s.
The accents were bad, though. The accents
Yeah,
were
none of them
terrible.
as good as mine. But
I had one. Got rid of it.
the state police, the Boston police, the FBI, none of us trusted each other, and understandably, because we were all trying to do each other in. It was horrendous, horrendous. And there's now several FBI agents doing well-deserved multiple-year sentencing in federal prison for their support of organized crime against the Boston police and the state police. So I've worked in an environment where you didn't trust anybody, to one now where you might have differences of opinion, but you're not purposely stepping on each other's investigations. They're sins of omission rather than commission. And if I recall correctly, and I'm not privy to some of the inside baseball on the case you referenced this morning, that one seemed to be really one of omission rather than trying to basically step on the FBI investigation.
Do we need an MI5?
That's a great debate that's going on, that the idea of, as the Brits do, they have these various types of investigatory entities. They've recently created a new one that's modeled somewhat after the FBI model. I think what we have is very good. We're constantly trying to find ways to refine it, to make it more inclusive, to make it, Fran talked about timeliness and attention. I'd add a third one to that element, that prioritization, that we need timely investigations. We need to pay attention to the greatest degree possible to the widest range of issues. But we also are always going to have prioritization. That because we can't, what's the expression? He who tries to do everything is doomed to do nothing ultimately. So we're going to have prioritization. And effectively, Jack Maple, if I may, for just a second, Jack Maple, the fellow that I work with in the NYPD to reform that department and the creation of Compstat in the 1990s that really re-energized American policing on how to do something about crime, which was so out of control.
Explain what Compstat is for those who may not be familiar with
Okay,
the
I'll
phrase.
get to that. But Jack had an expression that he had high school education. I think Jack actually had a GED, but he's probably the smartest person that ever lived in America on crime and what to do about it. And I was fortunately able to partner up with him. And Jack had an expression that you can expect what you inspect. And effectively, whether you're dealing with crime or whether you're dealing with terrorism, that if you're paying attention to it, then you're going to develop information that will allow you to make informed decisions. Compstat was the system that was created in the 1990s in New York City that ultimately transformed that department. Among a number of other strategies we used, it wasn't the single strategy, but it was probably it's like the engine in the vehicle. It's what moves the vehicle forward. You need tires, you need a steering wheel, you need brakes, but you also need an engine. Compstat was the internal combustion engine for changing American policing. In American policing, we were not good at gathering crime information and then using it to tell us where do we put our people, how do we develop strategies to deal with the different types of crime, the movement of crime. Compstat did all of that. It had 4 basic principles. And as I'm relating them to you, think of terrorism and how those 4 principles relate to terrorism. Because the good news is, as American police got better in the 1990s, local police were dealing with local crime. It can help inform local police to work better with their federal colleagues on terrorism-related crime. Timely, accurate intelligence. Gather crime information as quickly as you can, accurately as you can. That's why you don't want cops playing around with erasers and pointed pencils. You need accurate information because that's where it's going to tell you where you need to put your resources. Timely, accurate intelligence, rapid response to what that intelligence tells you. Before there's 15 or 20 robberies or murders or rapes, you want to start identifying a pattern or trend at number 2 or number 3 or number 4. Effective tactics, what works? Post-Mumbai, the tactics we had developed pre-Mumbai were probably not going to work for a post-Mumbai type of incident. So you have to develop effective tactics. And lastly, relentless follow-up. Crime is never going to go away. We're never going to solve it all. We can reduce it dramatically, as we fortunately have done in America. Similarly for terrorism, as we talked about this morning, terrorism is going to be here for all time. As the Admiral talked about last night, we'd like to kill them all, but unfortunately we can't. There's always going to be more. So we need to find other ways to deal with them. In policing, we cannot arrest our way out of the crime problem. We need to find other ways, more thoughtful ways to deal with the prevention of crime. Similarly, terrorism, the main thrust of terrorism is to prevent it in the first place rather than take satisfaction responding to it. If you think of what happened pre-9/11 under the Compstat system, timely, accurate intelligence, we had it. But the CIA was not talking to the FBI wasn't talking to amongst themselves. They had all of these characters, or many of them, in their sights, if you will, but they didn't share the information. So they could not rapidly respawn. And when they did respond, for example, when they went out to check about these guys who were taking plane lessons and all they wanted to know about was taking the plane off, they didn't want instructions on how to land it. That's a big clue. But in their investigations of it, they didn't basically follow up thoroughly enough. And they did not have relentless follow-up. And this is where it went back to prioritization. Human beings basically prioritized or made a decision this information was not relevant. Why? Because they didn't have the big picture. The repeat of the Christmas Day bombing. A lot of people had a lot of information, but a couple of human beings along the way didn't put it all together. Or if they did put it together, their decision was, well, this was not of concern.
There's one thing that you wanted to do in LA that you couldn't do, and that was the mapping. Talk to us about what that project was.
Okay. The term mapping in policing is a term we use all the time. Compstat is based on the mapping of crime. That as a young sergeant in Boston in the 1970s, as I was going to community meetings and people were talking about their crime situation, I figured, well, one of the ways is let me put a map up. And I had these huge maps in my office, and I used to every day have somebody put the dots on the map, red dots for murders, green dots for robberies, et cetera. And very quickly, you'd start spotting these hotspots. You'd start spotting trends, patterns and trends. And the idea there was that you can then assign your resources, your police resources, educate them as to, you got these robberies are going on, here's the information we have about who may be doing them. So when you're on patrol, here's some additional information for you how to look on it, how to look at that issue. The police have been engaged in mapping for years to identify problems. In policing also, one of the things we map for dealing with emergencies or dealing with terrorism threats is Jewish community, for example. Jewish community has worked with us for years because of the threats against them for years. Where are your synagogues? Where are your schools? Where are your sensitive locations? So that at a time of heightened threat, that we, the police, can in fact provide extra security to these identified locations. Or if we get a call through 9/11 that there's an incident occurring at 311 Broadway, well, 311 Broadway comes up that that's a synagogue. So you want to have additional information. As we were seeking to improve our relationship with our Muslim community, it was talked about by previous speakers that the effort in this new world we're living in is to deal with a large Muslim population, but a Muslim population that, unlike other countries, Britain, for example, has really merged into the mainstream of our communities. That there are very few communities in the United States where there's an identified Muslim population, where they literally take over whole neighborhoods or whole cities, as has happened in Britain. In the case of Los Angeles, the Muslim population, several 100,000 strong, is scattered over almost 1,000 square mile area. And many of their locations, whether they be mosques or educational centers, are not as clearly identifiable as they might be in other religions with the church spires, et cetera.
It could be a storefront.
It could be a storefront, and oftentimes is. And so as we were developing relationships with them, we thought it would be a good idea at times of heightened threat, that there was a terrorism incident and some of the backlash that might be directed against the Muslim community. We need to know, where are you? So that we can identify if a call comes in that there's a disturbance at 311 Broadway, we see that that's a mosque, so we know that's a more sensitive location. Well-intended effort, but in that community, with its sensitivity to being singled out and being targeted and concerns about what the federal government was doing relative to their community, the term mapping was like waving a red flag in front of the bull. And the damage from the use of that term, it was tremendous. It almost unraveled everything we had done. They thought this was just a covert way that we were trying to gather intelligence for our counterterrorism purposes rather than for our traditional police response purposes.
But in fact, don't police departments want to know where those populations are also for investigative purposes?
We don't need to really know where they are for investigative purposes as much, because you actually are looking to work on intelligence that's provided to you relative to an individual or maybe an organization. So as to having, you got ways to identify and locate that person. Are there certain entities, whether it would be a mosque or I can remember back in Boston in the 1970s, there was the Jewish Defense League, I think the JDL, which was basically in Boston, unfortunately, was thought to be committing attacks against minorities that were moving into their neighborhoods and forcing the Jews out. That you would want to basically focus attention on those organizations whose activities were, in fact, their activity was to basically commit a crime or engage in criminal acts or engage in terrorist acts. So would we want to know that a mosque or a group or an organization might be engaged in criminal activity? Certainly. I did that with gangs in New York, in LA in particular. The gang problem in LA, I knew exactly where every one of those gangs, the geographic location they claimed to be theirs, who was in the gang. We had gang files on 40,000 of them. That this is what police do. When we have a criminal threat, you gather information on who's engaged in that threat.
I want to take questions in just a second, but if I could pursue this idea of
Yeah,
working
we're
with
on
these
by already.
specialized communities. For instance, let's say Somalis. You want to talk to them, you want to get the sense of what's happening because you're worried that some people may be going over to fight, getting training, coming back, who knows. How difficult is it to build those bridges?
Incredibly difficult. That in the Los Angeles police force, 9,800 police officers, I think we had 6 identified Muslim officers.
6?
6. Trying to find people who speak the various languages of the communities you're concerned with, particularly if they're thought to be engaged in terrorist activities, members of the communities, that your desire to interact with those communities is multiple. One, you want to protect them against crime. And their fear of police, oftentimes, they won't report crime. And if we are basing the assignment of our resources on reported crime, if they're not reporting it, we can't solve it within their community, within their area. 2, you want to and I deeply believe this, use police to help them assimilate into a society. Instead of police being the flashpoint for, as we've been for so much of the racial tension in this country going back 400 years with the African American community, most of the events of the 20th century that flared up into civil disturbances usually resulted from a police action involving an African American and the volatile relationship that existed. So in LA, I spent a lot of my time trying to change it from a flashpoint to a cutting edge of improving relationships. So I could recruit better from that community, I could get more accurate information from that community, I could get victims and witnesses of crime to come forward, that you could improve the quality of life of that community. Well, it's the same thing with the immigrant population we're now dealing with, the largely Latino immigrant population. But it's the same thing also with some of these communities that are growing out of war-torn countries, such as the Somalians. They're coming out of societies where police are not respected or trusted, and they're coming into a society where, by and large, we are. And that it's a way of serving them better, but how do you get over their suspicion of us if, in fact, it looks like we're just looking to develop relationships to use them in a negative way against them. For example, we just had this situation in Arizona, reading the paper this morning, the governor down there. Basically, I don't know what she's been smoking lately, but the idea that the majority or all of the illegal immigrants coming into Arizona smuggling drugs into Arizona. Now, this is the governor of a state that basically, to make a statement like that, and what the Latino community in that state must feel like when the leader of that state is basically making that allegation, which was immediately refuted by the Border Patrol and everybody else, that it's that type of demagoguery that basically just raises fear among these communities. And then we, the police, have to deal with the fallout from this political foolishness.
Do you think that that sort of relationship building is an absolutely critical tool to the homegrown terrorism threat?
Absolutely. That when I went to LA in 2002, I purposely chose to go to that city because I have a great pride in my profession, policing, but I'm also very mindful of its role, its negative role, in perpetuating a lot of the racial divisiveness in this country. It's not just with African Americans, but has the potential that we're going to repeat the same mistakes with our Latino immigrant population or with our growing populations from war-torn countries. That let's learn from the past, let's not effectively repeat those mistakes. And so we spent a lot of our time building relationships with the community that's been here for 400 years, the African American population, but for 400 years saw the police, and for 380 of those years, we, the police, were the agents of government to keep them enslaved or enforce segregation or to basically keep them under control, if you will. We learned a lot, and in LA, I feel very good after leaving there that one of the accolades about the LAPD as it came out of the problems of the 1990s was it seems to have turned a corner in its relationship with its African American community. It's important that it be able to do that also with the Latino community and the Somalian community, and for purposes of terrorism, with the Muslim community. Because if you don't have their trust, then we're just bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. And police can be so much more important in not only race relations, our traditional issue, but in the era of terrorism. And this is another reason for advocating local police being allowed into the tent of the federal government as it relates to terrorism. There's so much we learn in terms of relationship building and how to do it, and that we can contribute to the discussion and the priorities and the politics of what we're engaging in.
Why don't we open it up? There must be questions out there. Am I blind? Oh, I see a hand up back there.
Catherine Herridge, Fox News. I want to pick up on your last point. Based on some of our reporting, this younger generation that's buying into this extreme message, they're typically avoiding the mosques or the Muslim community sort of writ large because they believe that law enforcement and the FBI is within those circles. So how, on the local level, do you try and tap into this sort of new rising generation?
By basically making ourselves known to them, building relationships, going to being comfortable, go to their services on a Friday, and with the imams would invite you to come in and talk to their community by also in a society where jobs are highly sought, that we have many jobs in policing that are open to them, both as police officers, but the myriad of other types of specialties that we have. And so building, and hopefully with the second generation, to not deal, not repeat the mistakes of the past in terms of not having any engagement, not having any awareness, not having any understanding of their customs and their mores. And that's another big aspect of this, that the average American police officer, prior to the events of 9/11, really probably did not have much of an understanding of this issue, the Muslim faith and the various factions, the various elements within that faith. Within the Protestant community, we have Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Baptists. Well, within the Muslim community, as we've seen in Iraq with the bloody battling that's going on between the various groups, that it is a very complicated world. It's not just one world, it's many worlds. And we need to know about that. We need to be appreciative of that so that we can, in fact, interact with them and be mindful of the sensitivities as we interact with that population.
I believe there was another hand up back there.
Yeah, a whole bunch over here.
Sorry.
Thank you. Commissioner, your first tour of duty in New York was actually as chief with the New York City Transit Police. If you were in that role today, how concerned would you be about the threat against terrorism in the New York City transit system? And in a general
Not that you
way,
have a vested interest in that subject.
how would you approach mitigating that threat?
Anybody that lives in New York has a vested interest because 5 million people a day get in and get on and off that system. I was chief of the transit police from 90 to 91 in New York City. Fortunately, the city of New York does prioritize that because we've had clear evidence of planned assaults against the subway system, several of which have been thwarted. So the subway system does remain a high prioritization, both to protect, but also from the terrorist perspective to attack. And so along with the bridges and the tunnels, that it's in some respects in New York, no matter where you look, it's a potential target, and that's one of the difficulties that the NYPD has to face. And fortunately, they have a very large department to be able to focus on all of those different threats. So I really can't think of anything I'd be doing differently with the intimacy I have with transit systems from the 2 departments I led, different from what they're doing in New York at the moment. They're getting their camera systems finally up and running, which is a big thing, as we know, that the importance of those systems to be coordinated, to be activated, and to be in place and used.
Do you think the federal government is giving the attention and money that's needed to mass transit?
In terms of the limitations, once again, there's only so much to go around. That's where the prioritization comes in. Transportation is one of those areas where there needs to be a focus because it is the lifeblood of, in the case of New York City, it is truly the lifeblood of that city. To a lesser extent in, say, a city like Los Angeles, but public transportation still is the way that millions upon millions of people move around in our country. And it was the discussion this morning about the breakfast I had prior to the general breakfast this morning, that the maritime industry was somewhat concerned but appreciative of all the resources that have been committed to the airline industry. And then public transit could say the same thing about being appreciative of the attention being paid to the airline industry because there's been so many threats against that industry. What's the expression? The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Well, in some respects, that's the decisions that have to be made. In terrorism-related expenditures, what is the likelihood for an attack, and in terms of prioritization of where should the initial money go?
Over here. I see you in a yellow shirt right here.
Commissioner, thank you for being here. I wanted to take the information sharing discussion down another level. Could you talk a bit about the strategies that you employed to reach out to private security that was looking at critical infrastructure in LA and the relationship that had to be built there and how that became a vital part of the fusion center?
That system was very much similar to what New York had also put in place, and indeed which many of the major cities around the country have done. The idea of the argument I'm making to the federal government, I and my colleagues, major city chiefs, is 700,000 to 800,000 eyes and ears in American policing. There's only about 40 to 50,000 federal agents in all of the various agencies. You need us. Similarly, the argument can be made with 2.5 million private security officers in the country that we need their eyes and ears. The expertise that resides in the private security sector. It's ironic, during the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was an explosion in the private sector security business. Why? Because American policing was contracting. We lost several 100,000 police officers. We were focusing our energy on responding to crime after the fact. What American business was focusing its energy on was preventing the crime in the first place. So they got into alarms, they got into cameras, they got into security fencing, they got into investing in the prevention of theft and loss. So there's a lot to be learned from that community, because they are much farther along in the use of technology, in the sharing of information, than public policing was. So when I talked about getting a place at the table, it needs to be a very big table, because a lot of people have to be at that table, and the table has to be a round one, so that we can all talk. It's like the spokes of a wheel. It can't be rectangular, it can't be a triangle. It has to be a round table, because everybody needs an equal voice in the discussion. Somebody at the designated head of the table will take all that information and make the decision, but everybody has to have a voice. And so the efforts in LA were to find ways to include information, but to disseminate information. And in the dissemination of information, much the same as American police chiefs are advocating the Homeland Security, get it to us even in its rawest form, as long as it doesn't, in a sense, compromise where the information was coming from. So we can make a local decision. If I've got a subway system and the threat is potentially against a subway system, well then, if I've got the resources, I can put additional personnel into that system for a couple of days. Similarly, if we've got a threat against a shopping center someplace in America, and Homeland Security doesn't necessarily want to put it out because they can't corroborate it, give it to us, and then let us then share it with our security personnel. So if the owner of the Grove or one of these other shopping complexes decides, well, I'm going to put on extra people here today just to be on the safe side. That's what I'm talking about on the sharing, that the idea of, I'm very big into inclusion rather than exclusion. Exclusion is what brought about 9/11. Exclusion was what brought about the crime crises in America in the 1970s and 80s. Inclusion is what began to solve the crime problem in the 90s, and inclusion is what will ultimately help us to not solve, but significantly mitigate in a positive way the terrorist issues we're facing.
I saw someone else with a hand.
We're all in this together.
We have two at this table. Why don't you go one after the other?
The Los Angeles Police Department has an unrivaled expertise in the study of gangs, and you mentioned gangs briefly when you were speaking. And I wonder if you see any read across from that to the study of terrorist groups, and if so, how that expertise can be shared, whether nationally or internationally.
In Los Angeles City, there were documented 40,000 gang members and approximately 400 gangs. In the county, about 100,000 gang members. As closely as we watch them, and we watch them very closely because they are the significant accelerant on our major crime problems, that we, during my 7 years, saw no interaction that we could detect between those gangs and the terrorism entities that we're so concerned with. And in Los Angeles, we had great capabilities because of the 40-year history of dealing with gangs and the growing expertise that we've been acquiring since 9/11 to share the information. That's another reason for having a fusion center, to watch for that, to see, is there the beginning of a morphing of these two other drug cartels that are so active along our borders now in Mexico, since they're involved in so much of the human trafficking that goes on down there. Would they be willing to basically start smuggling in in conjunction with terrorists actively and knowingly assisting moving terrorists into the United States. So we'd want to watch for that. So that argument for an all-crime center is the case we just talked about. The case makes itself. The idea, we want to watch to see if that evolves. We haven't seen it yet, not to say it might not occur. But the better our sources of intelligence and the willingness to look at that, we might be able to detect it if it does begin to form up. But so far, at least during my 7 years, we didn't see any of that.
Yes, thank you. I was struck, sir, by what you said about the number of identified Muslim officers in the LAPD, only 9. Did that make it harder to do this bridge building work, the kind of community policing? And why do you think that is? Why do you think there was such an underrepresentation?
The growth of the Muslim population has been, as the growth of the Muslim population in the United States, is a relatively recent phenomenon over the last generation or 2 generations. The change in the immigration laws in the 1960s totally changed the complexion of immigrants coming into this country, so that very few Northern Europeans and many more people from all over the world. But as those people were coming into this country, they were also coming in from countries oftentimes that really did not have good relations with their police. So police were not seen as a profession that they would want their kids going into. That in America, police are a strong middle-class profession. That all the polling shows that by and large, even when we're not good, that the public by and large has strong support for their police. In our immigrant communities, whether it be the Muslim community, whether it be our Asian communities, that Indian communities coming in from the country of India, because of the parents' experiences with policing in their countries, there is not a great deal of respect for the police profession. So they strongly discourage their children from joining police departments because it is not an esteemed profession. So that our problem in recruiting is not unique. It is a problem throughout the United States. My Asian population in the Los Angeles Police Department is about 6-7%, which is not equal to the overall population in the city. But it's an issue that we're addressing by exposure, as we're talking about exposure. We had a survey that was done when I was having trouble recruiting African Americans into the Los Angeles Police Department. And the survey, interestingly enough, disclosed that one of the disincentives for young African American men and women joining the department was the attitude of African American women toward the Los Angeles Police Department, who had seen for generations their men abused, their sons, their husbands, their brothers abused by the Los Angeles Police Department, so that the strong influence that women would have in that community was to discourage their young men, and then when we began hiring women in the 70s and 80s, their young women from going into the Los Angeles Police Department, because within the African American community, that was not seen as a job of any great esteem.
Some other questions out here? There's a blue shirt.
Christian Beckner from the staff of the Senate Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee. How do we take the model for local counterterrorism that you pioneered and have developed in Los Angeles, that Ray Kelly's developed in New York, and scale it down for small and medium-sized towns and cities, mindful of the fact that if you look at 2 of the most recent plots with Zazi and Shahzad, they were largely planned in Aurora, Colorado, and Bridgeport, Connecticut?
In terms of how I did it, I relied on a lot of people a lot smarter than me, that the inclusion I'm talking about. I had extraordinary people who come up with a lot of great ideas. The SARS program, the Homeland Security sponsored, the Archangel Program, which was the national model for how do you identify a critical site and then how do you protect it, developed in Los Angeles by local Los Angeles police officers. What I did, basically, good idea, advocated for it. Homeland Security, as they grew more sophisticated, supported it. But what Homeland Security attempts to do, in which I certainly, everything that we developed in the LAPD, and this is one of the reasons why they were very generous in their support of what we were doing, and I would imagine why they're very strongly supportive of New York City initiatives, Everything we did was with the idea of not only improving the security in Los Angeles City, but understanding the importance of partnerships with our colleagues in other cities and communities to spread the information out to them as quickly as possible. That I will beg, borrow, and steal from anybody, always with attribution. If you've got a better idea than me, that I'm not going to waste my time trying to invent the idea that you've already perfected. So whether it's Compstat, whether it's SARS, whether it's Archangel. And the beauty of all these things is their scalability. That the idea of Compstat, developed in the NYPD for a 50,000 person police department, but the 10-person police department, which is the average in the United States, can use the same system of put a map up on the wall, put the dots on the wall, and put your scarce resources where those dots indicate crime is occurring. So the scalability, if you think of it, of SARS, Suspicious Activity Reporting System, what Homeland Security is doing is attempting to move down to the chiefs of police in those 17,000 American police forces. Here's something that you can train your officers very quickly on. Here are these behavior detection models that you people can very quickly be trained, very inexpensively trained to watch for. The next manifestation of that is the American public. Van Townsend talked about it, that we need the public to be aware, but we don't want them afraid. We don't want them living in fear. But we do want to keep them aware of the importance of their information to police who are trained to receive that information and make intelligence out of it. And it is, now that I'm back living in New York, having lived in Los Angeles, it is quite clear in America, the farther you get from New York City, the less interest, the less awareness, the less prioritization there is on this issue. It is fascinating. In New York, there's stories about it every day. In LA, I had to work very hard against a political mindset with some of the leadership in that city that didn't want to spend resources on this because it just wasn't the priority any longer. Because we've been very fortunate. For 9 years, we've effectively not had an attack. We had the Fort Hood incident, but I would argue the Fort Hood incident was very similar to the 20 or 30 mass murders that we've had in the United States in the last 10 years.
But the program you built has been cut back.
Exactly. That one of the things that my successor, Charlie Beck, extraordinary guy, has had to deal with the budget difficulties in Los Angeles is, as the size of his forces remained the same, politically it sounds great, but what they're doing is they've cut out all those overtime so that instead of giving officers overtime for extra work, they have to give them compensatory time. So on an average day, he loses the equivalent of the 1,000 officers that were hired during my time as police chief. As a result, he has a force now that's the equivalent of the 9,200 that were there when I arrived in 2002. The 300 officers of the 1,000 that we hired that I put into counterterrorism, he had to reduce by about 30 or 40 the number of officers in counterterrorism. And I believe many of those were the officers who were working on the Archangel project, which is the critical site information program. So that's the terrible squeeze that we're finding ourselves in at the moment. And it goes back to the old adage, you can expect what you inspect. If we're drawing back from the capabilities to inspect, to gather information, to share it, then the potential for an incident or incidents to occur greatly increases.
Do we have time for one more? Or is that it? I see one. Let's take that one.
How generous of you.
I thought so myself.
Chief, I'm wondering if you see Compstat being applicable to fighting cybercrime moving forward, and just your thoughts on where the profession is going in the next 10 years.
Great thing about Compstat, the system, it's applicable to everything in life. Walmart Compstats every Saturday morning. They have all their managers call in, and they talk about timely, accurate intelligence. What sold this week, what didn't sell, what helped us to sell. What were the tactics that you used to sell, increase sales, and the relentless follow-up. They do it every Saturday morning. McDonald's every night wants to know how many hamburgers did they sell today so they can be supplied during the early morning hours so they're ready for you the next day. My wife Ricky and I always joke about the use of Compstat in personal lives. That in some respects I met Ricky through Compstat. That I was having breakfast at a hotel in New York City. She was at a different table with her new boss at Court TV, and she came walking over with him to introduce him, say hello. Timely, accurate intelligence. That she was looking quite beautiful that morning. I did a little flirting with her. We exchanged business cards. She gets into the cab with a new boss, and the boss says, he's going to call you. And Mickey says, nah, you know, we exchange cards all the time. The boss was right. Rapid follow-up. I had called by the time she got back to the office. Effective tactics, it took us a couple of months because of our crazy work schedules. I was traveling all the time to finally, we started trying to have a lunch and a dinner. We eventually settled for drinks at the King Cole Bar one evening. And relentless follow-up, a few months later we were married. So you can basically bring Compstat into any world, including cyber terrorism. It's all about gathering information, making intelligence out of it, and doing it all the time and constantly improving on it, and the constant education and improvement of the individuals that are going to have to make decisions based on that intelligence. You can have all the best information in the world, but if you have people who are so parochial they're not willing to share it, or they're not trained enough to recognize what the information is giving them away of intelligence, then it's all going to fail. Thus the importance of keeping high caliber people in government constantly working from the president on down to have inclusion rather than exclusion, federal, state, local. It's how we began to win the war against crime in the 90s. Since the 1990s, overall violent crime in the United States is down 40%, continuing to go down even in the midst of the recession. Overall crime's down 30%. Why? We just got better at what we were doing, and we keep at it all the time. Same thing with terrorism. We need to keep at it and keep getting better at it all the time. My own perspective is that we've come a long way. Still a long way to go, but despite the bumps in the road, we're doing okay.
Great.
Need to do better, but we're doing okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks. Yeah.